Good afternoon. My name is Amanda Irvin, and I am the Senior Director of Faculty Programs and Services at the Center for Teaching and Learning, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the very first Provost Conversation of 2024. Round of applause for 2024. Yeah, great. Before I introduce today's speaker, who we're just so excited to have on campus, a little bit about this conversation series. The Provost Conversation on Online Learning invites leading experts to share their vision of the future of education, specifically around online education or educational technology. We believe that through such conversations, we can learn and share knowledge with each other to ensure the best, most dynamic, and equitable educational experiences for all. To kick off the series this year, we have a very special guest to talk about what is probably one of the hottest topics currently in higher ed, generative AI, artificial intelligence. And who better to tell us about generative AI and how it will continue impacting higher education than someone from Google. Jeff Rubenstein has worked in technology for education since the 1990s and considers himself a mission-driven technologist. He has chosen to make his career in building technologies to improve the lives of students, teachers, instructional designers, and educational technologists. He has particular expertise in student information and learning system space, the online program management industry, and, as our luck would have it, artificial intelligence. Prior to working for Google, he held senior positions at Wimba, 2U, Kaltura, and Noodle. Please all join me in welcoming Jeff to Columbia.
Amanda, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for coming and for having me. I'm especially honored to be here because, as Amanda mentioned, educational technology for me is a mission. And that means it's part of my job to help spread and educate the next generations of educators and technologists. And today, I'd like to take a few minutes, probably about 20, 25 minutes, at the risk of trying to pack 10 pounds of information in a 5-pound bag. I will try and tell you everything I can about the state of AI and how I think you may want to think about AI in education. Hopefully you will walk away thinking that just throwing a gargantuan AI model at a problem is not a very good solution. And with some thoughts as to how we might do better than that. After that, we should have 20 minutes or so for some conversation, which I hope not to shortchange, because that's probably the most interesting part of today's hour. So why I'm really happy to be here is that AI is posing a challenge right now. Exemplified, I think, by this actual magazine cover. I was giving a talk to some CIOs in Portland, Oregon about 5 months ago. And one of them ran up to me with this thing saying, "You're from Google. What are you going to do about this?" And I said, "Hi, I'm Jeff. Nice to meet you too." But he posed an actual problem, which is that if the thought is that the big companies are going to solve this problem, we're not. Not because we're not smart people, and not because we haven't got a lot of good technology. But inherently, the problem of education is something that has to involve actual educators and practitioners and instructional designers and students. And we need your help with this. And I hope you realize walking out of here that this has to be a joint effort, and it is part of my job, I hope, to restore some sense of agency to the folks in this room and online, because we all have to be in this if we're going to not screw it up. So a couple things about AI in education. Right now, largely speaking, I think people are at the stage of very low table stakes of things like privacy. Right? We all know that in many cases AI all the data goes into some big database somewhere, which if teachers and staff are putting student data into certain models, that is a walking FERPA violation, right? You cannot put student data into an insecure environment, right? And so right now, folks are kind of, I think, on the back foot. They're reacting. How do I solve that problem? Okay, let's put it in a silo. Let's put it in some secure tenant, which is a good answer. But it's a reactive answer. Things like safety. How do I make sure that my model doesn't give answers that might threaten a student's well-being? There was a tragic case in Belgium last year where somebody said, who was very depressed, said something to an AI model, and at least the interpretation was something that led that person to do some harm to him or herself. Right? Obviously, that's a problem. And of course, cost is always an issue. And these problems are solvable, but they're really table stakes kinds of solutions. They're not going to move the needle. Where I think we have to focus our effort as practitioners is on the question of how do we use AI to move the education needle, which usually means something more like it's not just about what's true, it's about what's useful. I'll give you an example. Truth is actually a very low bar. There are lots of true things in the world. There are 18 true ways of doing long division. They teach one way in Japan and a different way in France, and they've changed how we teach it here since I was a kid. But of all the true ways of teaching long division, if some student asks an AI model, how do I do long division? What's the best answer the AI could give? What their teacher would say, or what their textbook does say. Because long division does not stand alone. It's part of a scope and sequence, right, that builds on prior knowledge and extends into other knowledge. So not all true answers are equally good. So how do we get AI to do that? Well, a couple of things. First off, let me just address the table stakes issues. Don't worry about the tech stuff here. I just grabbed the slide to illustrate the issue. Solving privacy is easy. You can put an AI model inside a private tenant. So no data ever leaves. It doesn't train the next generation of models. It's all kept private according to the standards of the institution. But where we start to get better models is, first off, to not think about models as monoliths. Google, for instance, is not a model. It has models, but there are lots of models out there, and some models are better fit for certain purposes than others. Models can be trained. They can be trained on corpora of information. They can be trained on a scope and sequence. They can be trained on state standards. They can be trained on the particular methodology that a particular teacher uses. So the thing to think about, and this is not talked about enough, I think, in the industry, is that you want to think about models, plural, and making better models for specific purposes. Big generic models are hot right now because they're interesting and they can do great circus acts. But smaller trained models are going to be the ones that can answer certain problems for certain people in certain contexts better, because they're going to be better at those kinds of things. So talking about generative AI, which, by the way, the terminology usually these days is, you probably all recall the AI. By the way, AI is not new. It's been around for quite some time. But the 10 years ago, the kind of AI everyone was familiar with was the kind of where you give your AI 500 pictures of cats and say these are cats. and 500 pictures of dogs, and say these dogs. And then you can train the AI to distinguish a new picture from is it a cat or is it a dog, right? And that was what was behind the algorithm of YouTube or Facebook or whatever. And about 6 years ago, there was a paper that was called Attention is All You Need, which solved a number of problems as a technique by, rather than having to use large tagged data sets, which are rare and often very biased, right? You could just look at the corpus of English language, which is also biased, but slightly less so. And then use, by looking at the entire corpus, start associating words with other words. And that was the birth of generative AI, where you could start creating things like poems and documents and that sort of thing. By the way, it was the combination of what's called the transformer architecture, along with two other notable things. Number one being cloud computing, massive amounts of compute and storage that could actually look at the whole English language. And curiously, video games also were important in this development because how basically AI is working is it's creating a very large n-dimensional space, where n is something like 200 billion, where everything is associated by a matter of how close it is with everything else. Well, it turns out that video games, which have become ubiquitous in the past 20 years in small computers, have for a long time been using what's called a GPU, a graphical processing unit, to calculate all those like first-person shoot-up things, right? People like love, which are all in 3D space. So it turns out that the chips that calculate 3D space well also calculate 4D, 5D, 6D, 200 billion D space pretty well. So it was actually the development and the commoditization of GPUs that was partly responsible for the moment that happened about 3 years ago, which was Gen AI. Anyway, so Gen AI is good at some things. It's really good at search and discovery. It's really good at answering factual questions with some caveats for what are known as hallucinations or confabulations. It's really good at translation, at pattern matching, and that kind of thing. And that does have some value, right? If you want to write a first draft or make a slide deck, things that are now available in Google or Microsoft, Copilot, what have you, it's pretty good at that, right? Those are nice time-saving tools. So those do have applications to certain workflows in education. But it's also really not good at a lot of things, although it will pretend that it is. So first off, obviously, it doesn't have any sensibility. It can't understand human beings in any way that's meaningful. It doesn't have any empathy. It doesn't understand what you know now so that it can explain it in your terms, which is important in education, right? There's always a frame of reference when it comes to explanations. And you have to know what that is if what you're going to say is going to make any sense at all as an explanation. It doesn't, of course, understand anything about the idea of a course of human development, right, which is what education is primarily about. And it doesn't understand anything about a student's prior learning, which skills they have and don't have. Again, it can build that up over time, and that's an important data source which we can talk about. But right now, generic AI has no idea who you are. And therefore, how, in principle, is it going to help you move from here to here? It can't, as a matter of principle, by construction. And that's a real problem. And so this is where I think we want to start talking about how we can move from this generic use of AI, where it doesn't know anything about you or your curriculum, to a more advanced use of AI, which does have value to education. Right? Which is just to say, and I think this is Christensen, but I'm not really sure anymore. I've been copying it so long I've forgotten. right? Education is not primarily about information transfer. And AI is great at search and giving you facts and giving you information. That might be a requisite step, might be facilitative, but it's not education in principle. Education is about human development, moving somebody from this state to this state. And that, in principle, generic AI cannot do. So what can we do about this? Well, we need to start thinking more about the context. And using context as a way of framing the task of AI, and context that we can provide to AI to give us more intelligent answers. So, for instance, who's asking? Is it a student? What skills does that student have? What have they learned and haven't they learned? Is it an instructional designer? What do they want? Is it a professor of some kind, right? Who is the user and what are they trying to do? What information do they have currently? What information are they missing? And what information is required to help them get to where they want to go? When you start adding data into the process, either contextual information or actual raw data about the user, we start to make some progress here. But I still think there will always be a remainder that a human has to step in. So how do we think about this? Well, we can use AI to help scale those humans. So if I have one thing that I've sort of made my career around, it's trying to solve or make progress with Bloom's two sigma problem. You probably all know this, but in case, I'll repeat more or less the idea. Students who have a baseline education with a class size of 30 to 1, right, get the average curve here. Students who get a private tutor, the orange curve, on average, the average of that curve is 2 standard deviations above the mean relative to the students who were 30 to 1. Which is probably not very surprising, but I'm glad there's scientific proof for it. So one question is, how can AI help solve this problem? Well, of course, by giving the student a little more personalization in the absence of a teacher, and on the other side, making that teacher more efficient by taking some of the work that doesn't require their attention off their plate. And if you've taught, you all know there's probably 90% of your time that you're doing this grunt work that doesn't actually serve teaching and learning very well. And that stuff could be outsourced, right? That core of you and the student face-to-face probably can't. So we want to give the students a more personalized experience than they have today. And we want to make the instructor have more of their bandwidth available for those very valuable contact hours, which is where they can move the needle. Right? Those are the 2 ways we can use AI to help this. Now, by the way, I will also say, because it's not only teachers, I have my own theory, which, with many apologies to Bloom, I'll call it Rubenstein's corollary, which is that what Bloom realized here is probably applicable to most things that have that human component, whether it's advising, or counseling, or some other kind of human intervention. I think medicine too, probably, right? Where you're going to have, if you have a private tutor, if you have somebody with the time and space available to work with you one-on-one for many, many, many hours, you're going to have a much better experience. But we don't have those humans available. So I think this is extensible to instructional designers and career counselors and a large number of the sort of helping professions that happen on campus or in an online school. So AI can help them as well. So here are just some ideas of things that AI can do. And ideally, we can start, by the way, we don't need a lot of data to get started. Ideally, we'll get more over time. But start with some data. With some data, AI can start creating questions for students at their level, in their language, et cetera. I mean, for instance, AI is very good at the following. Give me a reading passage on, pick your topic, the Civil War, at Lexile 500. AI is good at that, right? And then now imagine you're a teacher and you have a classroom of 30 and you need to make sure they can each get something a little bit challenging. Well, with one data point, the existent Lexile level of each student, I could go and say, print me out, or email me, or whatever you want to do it, right? Give me a reading passage on the Civil War at Lexile 500, 600, 700, 800, 1,000. There they are, right? You've just personalized the experience for students and taken a ton of work off the teacher. That's something AI can actually do really easily. For instructors, you can do, like I just mentioned, you can take away a lot of the preparatory work, a lot of which involves this kind of personalization. Free up their time to do more intelligent things or more useful things. You can also get rid of other administrative work of various kinds. Things like translation, if need be, or coordinating a translation or an accommodation of some kind. Right? These are things that take a lot of time. The AI can know all this in advance. Do you have an accommodation of some kind? Do you need a different language of some kind? And there should be, and by the way, today, there could be a button that you push. Nothing prevents that from existing today with a little bit of data and the existing AI models. Likewise for staff. I think accessibility is a huge issue, and this is a very, very wide concept, but especially with the number of first-gen college students who are now I believe about, last I saw it was about a third of current college students are first-gen. Speak a lot of different languages, have a lot of different contexts with higher education or even primary education. You can do much better student support by making that multilingual. You have one set of documents that gets translated on the fly rather than having to have managing, I have my stack of Spanish documents and they're out of date the day they're done. Right? All the administrative processes that students have to confront and staff have to help them with. There's a lot of that we can take the friction out using intelligent AI. So just a couple thoughts for areas that if you want to pursue or make your startup are really interesting. Obviously, everything in the idea of student success, again, from personalization to helping them access all the various functions on campus. Right now, I don't know about Columbia in particular, but if I were a first-gen or non-native speaker of English and I was thrown at 18 years old onto a campus and had to deal with housing, bursar, registrar, career center, sports center, job, financial aid, I mean, there's like 15 help desk functions. Right? That's not easy. And we wonder why the dropout rate is as high as it is. For teacher or instructional designer effectiveness, there's all kinds of stuff we can do here. We can have content created, again, that is personalized. We can have content created in various languages. We can have content created against certain standards. We can have content created from specific corpora of information. pretty much automatically. And the human's going to want to oversee it to make sure that it's, on track. But we can pull out an awful lot of the work using AI. And then, of course, research and administration. This is a bit further from education, but obviously the lifeblood of many institutions is paid for by research. And right now, research, the way that people access it is there. It's so 2000s, right? It's lots of web pages. When right now you can actually we could very easily have the researcher say, hey, here are my research interests and qualifications. Go find me grants I can apply for. And write me a first draft of the grant application. Right? We can do that now. Again, taking out some of that grunt work. Again, just as a couple of illustrations of concepts, this is something that we could do for students, make their life easier by translating all the documentation, by giving them one-shot access to all the help desks they might need. Something else that, this is actually live, it's just a project now. You can go check it out online, just Google ShiftBot. It's a fun project we did with a professor at NYU. I mentioned that understanding the context is important. Because again, generic AI doesn't get you very far. It's not nothing, but educationally it's not fabulous. So what we did here was we took AI and we trained it on one professor's corpus. Both from YouTube videos he made, from class notes, from coding examples. The guy's name is David Schiff. And, you can tell, by the way, we had some theater majors do it because it's got his face dancing around everywhere. By the way, we do hire theater majors if you're, if anyone, any friends need a job. Anyway, but it's trained on his corpus. So all the answers are basically his. And his personality is there. And AI can do that. By the way, something else you should try if you want a cool exercise. AI is actually really good at imitating people. Not just deepfakes. With an advanced enough model, you go and you say, have a dialogue with me as if I'm Caesar or Marcus Aurelius. It's quite fascinating, actually. You should give it a try. So this is how, another way, again, you can really get to the specificity of answers that will make a difference for students. It's your professor who's running this bot. And lastly, I mentioned grants, in case you're curious. This is a way you can search for and apply for grants. It takes out all the grunt work of doing that, gets you to a first draft in a couple clicks. This is a way, again, if your institution is very grant dependent, that we can accelerate, or AI can accelerate the ability of teachers to do that work, or professors to do that work. All right, so a couple of near-term advances to watch. What's coming next, which is the next big question. So, by the way, I still think that hopefully you'll walk away thinking, okay, I believe it. It's not about the model. By the way, as it's now well said, we now have the worst models we're ever going to have. Right? They're going to get better. They're going to get better every 5 months. Right? Don't obsess over the model. It's much more about the context and the data. That's how you move the needle educationally. But what's coming next? A couple thoughts and things to watch. First, right now, AI is in a bit of this mode of, because it's trained to, it just gives you the answer, right? Which is not, it's fine. I mean, but it's not going to help you get to the answer. It's just going to give you the answer. So we're starting to train models that are educational specific in the following way. They understand that there's an answer, but they can understand there may be 10 steps to get there. And that they will say, hey, did you try this step? Did you try, what do they call it? Grouping your variables, whatever the thing is, right? Putting all the x's together, right? Did you try using a quadratic function. I'm making it up. I haven't done math in 30 years, right? But it'll start prompting you for steps along the way. So it kind of, as it were, struggles with you or goes at your pace. That kind of co-student idea. Second thing, which is interesting, is what I would call the ability to have an agent. Technically, they often call it REACT, so which is reasoning in action, where an AI tool can actually help figure out for you the kinds of steps you need to take to get to an answer. For instance, if you tell it, this database has student IDs, and this database has student balances, and you want to know, are the student IDs in a certain range or in a certain year, do they have higher balances than others? And it can say, oh, okay, I have this bit of information here, I have this bit here. If I join those two tables, I can get the answer. And then I can actually propose a course of action. It can say, hey, I think the answer is this. Take this table in this field, join it with this table in this field. Does that seem right to you? And you hit yes, and then it will execute. And lastly, on the database point, right now, of all the data we've talked about, what's the student's language? What's their Lexile level, for instance, or other skill data? What's their zip code, or what's their parents' education? This data is spread all over everything, which makes the kind of data mining we want to do to help make AI better a bit of a challenge. So one thing we're doing more and more now with AI is that AI can start to do that work for us without a big lift and shift effort, where in the past we'd have to say, okay, we got to get all these databases together, we got to over there, right? And it was too expensive and no one wanted to do it. So AI now, with enough information about what's stored in each place, can actually start to join that data, leaving it where it is. And that's going to be interesting, because that's going to then power all the good stuff that AI can do with better data. I know we're not there yet, which is why I said to start with small data, but we can get more and more data over time. So again, final, sum it up, recommendations. Really importantly, don't think about a model. It's a big monolithic thing. It's like a Wikipedia on steroids. Right? That by itself does not teach. Think about solving concrete problems and concrete workflows by concrete people. I am a teacher. I need to spend less time doing prep work. Okay? What prep work can I outsource to an AI so that I can preserve that space and time to have the contact hours that only I can provide? Right? That's a better way to think about it than just thinking I'm going to throw AI at it and it's going to solve the problem. Number two, data. Data here is what will actually make AI not generic. And again, generic AI, okay, it'll do something. It's not going to teach very well, because it doesn't actually know who you are, what your skills are, what you need to know now and next. Three, obviously, is drive systemic change. This is largely, of course, a question of organization, because these efforts do take time and resources to do. So try and think about this with classes of people. How can I help my teachers? How can I help my instructional designers? Because helping one person or a one-off case is usually not very effective when it comes to technology. By the way, this goes back in a way to the Bloom's point, because that little sliver that humans, and only humans can do, that you can't automate. And you shouldn't try. It's a one-off contact hour with a student. So focus on those things you can do for classes of people. And again, finally, this is early days for all of us, so start small data, start a couple of models, and grow from there. With that, I hope I have discharged my self-appointed task of telling you everything I know in 25 minutes. And I thank you so much for your attention, and we'll move to Q&A.
So we're going to, as Vin rearranges our furniture here, we're going to move to Q&A, and I will kick us off with a question. And Abby has generously agreed to run the mic around the room when we open the Q&A up to the rest of the room. So when we get to that point, if you have a question, raise your hand. You've done this before. We'll work it out. Jeff, thank you so much. Let me get into my chair before I get started.
Like I said, it's a pleasure. I mean, honestly, it is part of my life to help educate the next generation of technologists and teachers, so I could not be happier to be here. And hopefully, together, we won't all screw it up.
Here's hoping. So you've given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciated, we were talking before, as everyone was coming into the room, that a lot of the questions or a lot of the commentary or articles that have come out about generative AI, we all remember November 2022, it was lots of prediction and lots of alarm, but it's always very much at the 3,000 foot level. And I really appreciated your tactical, here are the ways that we might be able to see ourselves in this conversation. So thank you for that. To extend upon that a little bit, one of my very favorite parts of your introduction was your dedication to supporting educators and students and instructional designers and educational technologists. We've got lots of those people in the room. And I take your point that these large models that we have now, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you seem to be saying is that's not where a lot of the power is at when it comes to education, because these are giant systems and there might be something that is more nuanced that would be useful. But if there are folks in the room today who are very focused on student learning and are working at, they'd like to go do something tomorrow, or they'd like to start thinking about that, they're interested in innovating, but also very dedicated to maintaining a focus on student learning, where would you encourage those people to begin? Yeah,
it's a good question. And certainly, I mean, you start with what you have. And what we have today are these large language models. And I would encourage you to say, pick your favorite. What will be more and more important is the contextual data. What are you trying to solve? And if you do a good enough job prompt engineering, and you've seen examples of them, I'm sure, that say, okay, and they can be pages long, okay, you are an expert teacher, and you have access to the standards of New Jersey, and you have a number of students, one of which speaks Spanish, and you have blah, 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 and you have 20 pages of prompt engineering, you'll get a decent answer. It won't be terribly scalable as an exercise, I'm guessing, but it'll work, right? And look, start experimenting. Why not, right? And then by the time it comes to maturity, we'll have better models, we'll have smaller models. I still think what you're going to find out, and I could be wrong, my opinion, is that all the work that's happening there is actually your brain and less the actual AI. That's doing the heavy lifting in that case. So, but when better ones come along that have more modalities to them, that have a dialogue modality or whatever, you'll be ready for it. So start where you are. I just encourage you to think that the AI model is not what's doing most of the work in that kind of case.
Yeah, thank you for that. Sorry, thank you for that. Okay, one final question and then we'll open it up to everybody. So I very much appreciated hearing that there are certain things only humans can do. Last spring, the Center for Teaching and Learning ran a session titled, somewhat provocatively, Are Humans Still Relevant? Teaching and Learning with Generative AI. And the room was packed, my friends. And so your mentions over and over that it's really important to stay the human in the loop, as Ethan Malik might say, it is taken well, and I think a lot of us know that learning is relational. And so when you think about the power of generative AI in education and know that there are certain things that educators will have to be there for, I know you mentioned contact hours, what do you imagine are the things only humans could do that we maybe shouldn't offload?
Yeah, there's a whole list of them. In fact, there's probably more on that side than the other side, but I'll just start with a few. And by the way, I'm not alone in this. I mean, I'll tell you that one of the smarter people, and Malik is one of them, by the way, but Jan LeCun whatever you think of his company, is one of the smartest people thinking about AI today. He works for Facebook, Meta. And he actually said, and I don't know to what degree he actually means that information is everything, but he did actually, in a few recent posts, cite the amount of informational content that passes through our eyeballs since the age of 5 or 10. And it's some grand order of magnitude more than any model is going to do in any time soon. And then he actually went further and said, okay, and then now think about our other senses. Think about skin and hearing. And like there's no, it's not even close. We're nowhere near having a model that can contain that much information. So given that we are humans, with most of what we learn is through our senses, before we even get to language. I mean, language is recent, right? Language is 40,000 years old, right? Human bodies are 250,000, and most of our bodies go back billions. Large language models are only scratching a tiny, tiny surface of human knowledge and experience. And that, I think, is a good perspective to have, because that puts in, I think, in perspective what the role of teaching is. Teaching is about human development. A thing that has no sensibility, has no trauma, has no love, has no interests or motivations, is indeed a very poor thing to think is going to create most of what we call education. That may be an answer, but I...
No, that's definitely an answer. All right, so as promised, I will open the conversation up. I don't want to gatekeep the expert in our room, one of our humans in the loop. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand, and Abby will generously run the mic to you, please.
Thank you. My name is Javid. Okay. My name is Javid Husinov, and I'm a professor with the Applied Analytics program. So question I have is, you've talked a lot about how AI can be used for education, but one of the challenges is how does it actually work in case of assessment? So if I'm designing that next exam, I can, of course, make a point to make it closed book, but if it's an open book exam, how do I actually design the questions in such a way? And you've alluded to some of the methodologies that may lead to that, such as chain of thought.
Yeah.
But how do you actually design the question in such a way that Gen AI cannot answer it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and let me start with the question that is still out there about plagiarism. Just stop trying. It is mathematically impossible to detect plagiarism, and the harm that trying to has done is quite large. So I would just change your pedagogy on that one. In terms of exams, I think probably the best answer I can give is more and more things that humans can do are being are able to be done by AI, right? I mean, we're looking at a future now where people have said, we were lied to. Everyone said be a coder 10 years ago, but now AI can code. Like, now what do I do? Well, by the way, I mean, AI can do the base level coding, sure, but AI, and it can do a little bit of debugging, right? But AI is not really an engineer, right? It's not really an architect. It's taking pretty clear instructions and turning it into code, right? What like product managers have always done, right? That's the level that AI is at, and it'll keep growing. So if what's being assessed has to be something that AI can do, then you probably have to find a way to stop people from using AI while they're doing it. But in my view, the better thing to do would be to create exams that AI can't solve. And that's still going to be, that will get nibbled away at over time, to be sure. But that's still going to be the vast majority of the higher order thinking. Does that answer your question? You're not convinced.
I mean, it's becoming increasingly more difficult to
Yeah.
sort of design them as these models evolve. But there are different approaches, like you can try, for example, using images instead of text. That helps to address, but that also has a certain time limit beyond which it will become. So this is a real challenge, right? How do you actually? So maybe I was thinking maybe there are approaches like such as chain of thought prompting, where you can actually break down the sort of decision process that leads to the answer, and sort of design the questions, maybe sort of reverse engineering that. So.
It's possible. I think it depends a lot on the field of study you're concerned with. But I think I'm more inclined, and understanding that this then puts more effort on the assessment part. I mean, I always think in the old days, actually I don't know what's happened to them in the past few years, the AP exams were always frightfully expensive which is a different problem, but because they're hand graded. I mean, they're not multiple choice. They're not something the machine can read. An actual human had to sit there and evaluate each exam, and that's because they were pretty good exams. I mean, they were very rigorous, and so they needed an actual human to review them. And I think we may need to move to a mode of assessment, or more of a mode of assessment that's more performative, where somebody does something on video, for instance, to show you they can think through it themselves, or where they have to show you not just the answer, but all of the background, or how this would have been answered 100 years ago before X was discovered, this kind of thing. I mean, it's more work to grade them, but that's probably the best answer I have, which is not very good.
Thank you. Other questions? And I'll just say, as Abby's moving that mic around, if anyone's looking for support in rethinking their pedagogy, the Center for Teaching and Learning is here to support you in that. We have time for one or two more questions. Oh, yeah. Dealer's choice, Abby.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Kimberly. I work as a course operations manager, and I'm very sensitive to the idea of good data quality. And I was wondering if you are hopeful in AI being able to help vet data for quality. And I share this because I was very excited the other day to see in Google Sheets, there's now a feature that will give you some recommendations on how you can analyze and clean your data. So I do recognize that's something that humans still contribute to scan data and see what the outliers may be, but is there a direction where AI can help with this as well?
It certainly can, and it's not my particular area, but I have colleagues who spend a lot of time looking at how AI can help analyze and clean up data automatically if it comes in, not at the quality you'd like. I'm also very hopeful that if we solve the database problem with AI, we can help solve the data cleanliness problem, because there's a couple big sources of uncleanliness. One of them is just that the instrumentation is bad, right? And if your instrumentation is bad, if you don't get the right signals from the student interaction to begin with, or rather it's not instrumented at all, which is the worst case, then you have a very bad start. And if you do get the instrumentation right, i.e. you're getting the right bit of data from the student at the right time, then if they're disparate databases or they're not formatted the same way or whatever, that's less of a problem. But it's been a long-standing problem, especially in education, because education has just grown up with point solutions. I mean, it's grown up with, you have an LMS, and that's badly instrumented to begin with, and you launch into a video tool or a digital product, and that gets bad data. I mean, I'll put in a quick plug for One Ed Tech. If you are not familiar with the organization, I'm on the board of directors of this organization. It was formerly called IMS Global. And we wrote the standards around LTI and one roster and that kind of stuff. And one of their projects is called Caliper. And it's precisely a project to get instrumented data from all these various systems into sort of a common data model to make exactly what you want to do possible. But we're, as an industry, very far from that right now.
Thank you so much. And I think we had one final question in the back. Corey, you want to close us out?
Sure. So really appreciate you saying that teaching is not the same thing, information transfer is not the same thing as education. Education is a process. But then we also see that we can use AI to generate first drafts of things. But one of the critiques of AI used for that purpose is that the process of writing a paper is the process of synthesis and developing reasoning and as a result, developing critical reasoning skills, and that's one of the purposes of higher education. So I'm wondering how AI can not just avoid that criticism, but swing the pendulum back fully the other direction, and how does AI facilitate the development of critical reasoning skills?
Right, excellent question, thank you. And I hope I didn't suggest that I thought that first drafts were a good thing for instructional purposes. If I did, I apologize. I only meant to say that AI can be useful for if you want to save time and draft a letter to your parents or a letter to your class or whatever. Yeah, it'll save you a few seconds. I don't think it's a great tool for writing. And again, I'm not myself a writing instructor, and I do take it very seriously. I will say there's a couple of thoughts I have. One was we were talking about Ethan Mollick earlier, who very interesting thinker about AI. He works for Wharton, a professor there, and he came out with a book recently that he says he co-wrote with AI. He didn't have AI write it for him, he says, but he co-wrote it. I'm unclear on the exact details, but he put it in his book called Co-Thinking. What is it called again? Co-intelligence, thank you, which I think is a very interesting concept. And so there may be something in there that is okay. And if you believe, I think it's T.S. Eliot, but don't quote me on that, who says all writing is rewriting. And that your final draft should look nothing like your first. There may be something in there of interest where maybe you do have AI write a draft and you're like, that's all wrong, I'm going to write it better now. And here's why it's wrong. I can also imagine stuff that's more mechanical, although I don't think that AI is going to be very good. It'll get maybe basic grammar and sentence structure and stuff. I don't think it's going to be very good at writing, nor reading for that matter. If you actually give Hemingway to an AI and say, how good is this? They'll say, it's crap. Because, no, honestly, AI has no idea what to do with Hemingway. I did a really early study 20 years ago, no more than that, when the SAT went essay. They added an essay to the SAT. And they had people, they graded it with people, because back then it was all in pencil, not like today. And God, I sound like an old man. Something happens to you, you turn 50, and like all of a sudden. Anyway, so I did the study where so they had people read, they sat down people at these big tables and started reading the essays. And they graded it on a rubric, 1 to 5 points, right? And if 2 graders graded it the same score, that was it. If 2 disagreed by more than a point, then they went to a third, right? And they had to read these in like 3 minutes each. So basically you couldn't do anything of any subtlety at all, right? You had to like beat somebody over the head, say, here's my point, here are my 3 examples, here's my conclusion, and that got a 5, right? And so I said, all right, it's fun, right? I'll give them some Hemingway, right? They all got 1s and 2s, because in 3 minutes, what are they going to think? So I don't actually think AI is going to be terribly interesting at either reading or writing at any degree of subtlety or interest. But that's my non-expert opinion.
Thank you all for joining us for the year's very first Provost Conversation on Online Learning, but a special thank you to Jeff for joining us. This conversation has given us a lot to think about. It's been very provocative. I think we're going to be thinking about it for a while. Please all join me in a round of applause thanking Jeff for his contributions. Join us for the next Provost Conversation on Online Learning, coming to you soon. Have a great day, everyone.